In the early hours of a cold medieval morning, long before clocks measured time and before science explained the heavens, people looked up at the sky and felt something was terribly wrong. Church bells that should have rung at dawn remained silent. Farmers paused in their fields. Monks stopped mid-prayer. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the light of the sun began to fade, not like a passing cloud, but as if the sky itself were being erased. Then it happened. The sun darkened, and what remained was not black, but red, a deep, unsettling crimson, as if the heavens were bleeding. Medieval chroniclers would later struggle to describe what they saw. Some wrote of a wounded sun. Others spoke of a veil of blood stretched across the sky. To the people who witnessed it, this was not a natural phenomenon. This was a message, a warning, an omen sent directly from God, or perhaps from something far older. Children cried. Animals panicked. Grown men fell to their knees in terror. In churches across Europe and the Near East, candles were lit in haste as priests recited prayers meant for the dying. Many believed the world itself was ending. But among the fear and confusion, there were those who did not panic. They watched. They measured. They recorded. Hidden in the shadows of this moment were men who understood that this red eclipse was not chaos. It was order. Not randomness, but timing. And according to forbidden whispers preserved only in fragments, these men already knew it was coming. They were the Knights Templar. Official history tells us that eclipses terrified medieval people because they lacked scientific understanding. That explanation is comforting. It allows us to believe our ancestors were simply ignorant, trapped in superstition, seeing monsters in the sky where none existed. But the truth, as always, is more complex and far more unsettling, because some medieval orders did understand the heavens, and they understood them far better than we are told. The Knights Templar were not merely warriors in white cloaks bearing red crosses. They were bankers, architects, engineers, diplomats, and scholars. They operated across continents. They had access to ancient libraries, forbidden texts, and knowledge that predated Christianity itself. Knowledge that spoke of cycles, of time not as a straight line, but as a repeating pattern. And at the center of that pattern was the sun. Ancient civilizations across the world, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, from the Maya to early Hebrew scholars, recorded eclipses with obsessive detail. Not just when they occurred, but what followed them. Famine, war, plague, the fall of kings, the collapse of empires. Over time, a disturbing idea emerged. Eclipses, especially those that turned the sun red, seemed to coincide with moments when history itself fractured. This idea was never meant for the masses. It was dangerous knowledge, because if disaster could be anticipated, if collapse followed a pattern, then history was not guided by free will alone. It was guided by something mechanical, predictable, almost programmed. The Church outwardly condemned such thinking. Publicly, eclipses were framed as divine warnings meant to inspire repentance. But privately, certain orders were allowed, even encouraged, to study them, to record them, to search for meaning beneath the symbolism. The Knights Templar were one such order. Legends claim that during their years stationed in Jerusalem, beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple, the Templars uncovered more than gold and relics. They uncovered texts, star charts, astronomical tables so advanced that even Renaissance scholars would later struggle to replicate them. Documents that suggested eclipses could be calculated centuries in advance, and that some eclipses carried far greater significance than others. Among these was a phenomenon described only in hushed tones, the Red Eclipse. Not every eclipse qualified, only those that aligned with specific celestial cycles, only those that occurred at precise moments within a larger cosmic rhythm. When these conditions were met, ancient texts warned of an age ending and another beginning. The medieval world stood unknowingly at one of these thresholds. As the red eclipse passed and sunlight slowly returned, the world did not end. No fire fell from the sky. No angels appeared. Life went on. And yet, in the months and years that followed, something shifted. Kingdoms destabilized. Conflicts intensified. Disease spread in ways that defied explanation. Trust in institutions began to erode. Most people never connected these events to the sky above them, but the Templars did. In hidden chambers lit by oil lamps, they compared records, dates, symbols carved into stone. They noticed patterns repeating across centuries. Always the same sequence, always the same signs, and always at the beginning, a darkened sun stained red. This knowledge placed them in a dangerous position, because to understand the timing of collapse is to threaten those who benefit from stability, kings, popes, empires. If people believed that disaster was written into the stars, authority itself would weaken. Obedience would crumble. Hope could turn into fatalism. And so the prophecy could not be allowed to spread. What survives today are only fragments. A line in a monastery chronicle that abruptly ends. A church aligned strangely with the rising sun on a specific date. A Templar seal marked with symbols that make no sense unless one understands the sky. Official history dismisses these details as coincidence. But coincidences do not repeat with mathematical precision. As this documentary unfolds, we will follow those fragments back through time. We will trace the path of the Red Eclipse through ancient civilizations, secret orders, and suppressed archives. We will ask why the Knights Templar, an order supposedly destroyed for heresy and corruption, were so deeply connected to the heavens. And we will confront a question that is as uncomfortable today as it was in the Middle Ages. What if the Red Eclipse was not a warning of the end, but a reminder that history moves in cycles, and that we are never as far from collapse as we believe? Because somewhere in the forgotten margins of medieval prophecy, a final note was written, not meant for kings, not meant for the church, but for those who would come later, for us. And when the sun turns red again, the warning may no longer be hidden. To understand why a red eclipse terrified medieval Europe so deeply, we must step fully into the mindset of the age. This was a world without scientific reassurance, without telescopes, without equations to soften the fear of the unknown. The sky was not a distant vacuum of planets and stars. It was alive. It watched. It judged. And when it changed, people believed something unseen was speaking. Medieval Europe existed on the edge of certainty and chaos. Life was fragile. Death was constant. Famine could wipe out villages in a single season, and disease could spread faster than prayer. Most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born, never questioning that the order of the universe was fixed and divinely controlled. God was not an abstract idea. He was an active presence in storms, in harvests, and especially in the heavens. The sky was the ultimate authority. Every sunrise reaffirmed order. Every sunset marked survival. But when the sun itself began to behave strangely, that order collapsed. An eclipse was not merely darkness. It was betrayal. The one celestial body that never failed had suddenly vanished. Church teachings reinforced this fear. Scripture spoke of signs in the heavens preceding judgment. The book of Joel warned that the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood. The Gospel of Matthew echoed the same imagery. These verses were not symbolic to medieval minds. They were literal forecasts. And when the sky matched the words, panic followed naturally. But fear alone does not explain the obsession with eclipses. Medieval Europe was also a place of inherited memory. Stories were passed orally across generations. Tales of past calamities tied to strange skies. Villages remembered eclipses that preceded plagues. Monasteries preserved accounts of darkened suns followed by war. These stories accumulated quietly, forming a shared subconscious belief that eclipses were markers of transition, moments when the normal rules no longer applied. What made the situation more complex was that Europe was not intellectually isolated. Despite popular belief, the Middle Ages were not entirely ignorant. Knowledge flowed through unexpected channels. Islamic scholars in Al-Andalus, Jewish astronomers in Iberia, Greek texts preserved in Byzantium. Astronomy was one of the few sciences that crossed religious boundaries, because every civilization depended on the sky for calendars, navigation, and ritual timing. By the 12th and 13th centuries, advanced astronomical knowledge had quietly re-entered Europe. Tables predicting planetary motion circulated among scholars. Arabic texts explained eclipse cycles with startling accuracy. This knowledge, however, was not widely shared. It remained concentrated in monasteries, royal courts, and secretive orders. And this is where tension emerged. On one hand, the Church publicly preached that eclipses were divine signs beyond human understanding. On the other, it quietly allowed select scholars to calculate them. This contradiction created a dangerous divide between public belief and private knowledge. To know when the sky would darken, and to say nothing, was a form of power. Most people never realized this divide existed. They saw only the ritual responses: bells rung backward, public fasting, processions through the streets. In some regions, people beat drums or clashed metal objects, believing the noise would scare away whatever entity was devouring the sun. In others, rulers ordered executions delayed or judgments postponed, fearing that any action taken under a darkened sun would be cursed. Time itself seemed to pause during an eclipse. Kings hesitated to make decisions. Armies delayed battles. Contracts were suspended. It was as if history held its breath. These pauses, repeated over centuries, reinforced the idea that eclipses were not moments of chaos, but hinges upon which events turned. Yet not everyone responded with fear. In secluded chambers and candlelit libraries, a different reaction unfolded. Scholars observed calmly. They tracked the progression of shadow. They compared notes with older manuscripts. They noticed that eclipses followed rules, patterns, intervals. This realization was unsettling. If eclipses could be predicted, then their symbolic power changed. They were no longer random messages from God. They were scheduled events, predictable disruptions written into the structure of time itself. And if they could be predicted, then the disasters associated with them might also follow patterns. Such thinking was dangerous. It challenged the Church's monopoly on divine interpretation. It threatened kings who ruled by the idea of divine favor. It suggested that history was governed not solely by morality or faith, but by cycles beyond human control. As a result, astronomical knowledge became tightly regulated. Certain books were copied only in fragments. Others were locked away. Some disappeared entirely. Knowledge of eclipse cycles existed, but only in controlled environments, shared among those deemed trustworthy or powerful enough to be dangerous. The Knights Templar emerged precisely within this environment. They lived at the intersection of faith and warfare, devotion and secrecy. Their vows bound them to obedience, but their missions exposed them to knowledge far beyond ordinary monks. Traveling between East and West, they encountered scholars who spoke openly of celestial cycles unknown in Europe. They carried information across borders that others could not cross. And most importantly, they kept records. Medieval Europe relied heavily on memory and oral tradition, but the Templars documented obsessively. They cataloged routes, fortresses, finances, and according to persistent legends, astronomical events. Not as superstition, but as data, patterns to be analyzed. To the average peasant, an eclipse meant fear and prayer. To the Templars, it meant confirmation. Confirmation that ancient warnings were real, that cycles recorded centuries earlier were repeating, that history itself moved in waves, rising and falling with the sky. This difference in perception created an invisible fault line in medieval society. Above ground, sermons warned of sin and repentance. Below ground, calculations continued. Above ground, eclipses were framed as punishment. Below ground, they were markers, checkpoints in a much longer timeline. And Europe itself seemed to sense this tension. The centuries leading up to the Templars' fall were marked by instability. Crusades drained resources. Monarchies struggled to maintain authority. The Church faced internal corruption and external criticism. It was a civilization quietly approaching a breaking point, even if no one could yet name it. The Red Eclipse was not the cause of this instability, but it was the signal, a reminder that the medieval world was not eternal, That faith alone could not shield civilization from forces written into the fabric of time, and that some among them knew what was coming, even if they could not stop it. As the next sections will reveal, the Knights Templar did not simply observe these celestial warnings. They integrated them into their worldview. They encoded them into stone, symbol, and silence. And when the world began to shift in ways that matched the sky's darkening, the knowledge they carried became too dangerous to ignore. Medieval Europe stood on the edge of the unknown, not because it lacked knowledge, but because too few were allowed to have it. And when the sun turned red, it was not ignorance that trembled the most. It was power. The Knights Templar did not begin as the powerful, mysterious order that history remembers. Their origin was humble, almost fragile. In the aftermath of the First Crusade, Jerusalem had fallen into Christian hands, but the roads leading to the Holy City remained deadly. Pilgrims traveling from Europe were robbed, assaulted, and often killed before ever reaching their destination. Out of this chaos emerged a small group of knights with a singular mission: to protect travelers on the road to Jerusalem. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. At first, they truly were poor. 9 knights, no wealth, no land, no banners flying over castles. They lived under monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They slept in shared quarters and ate simple meals. To the outside world, they appeared no different from any other minor religious brotherhood. But appearances, as with all things tied to the Templars, were deceiving. Within a few decades, the order transformed into something unprecedented in medieval history. They became an international organization operating across Europe and the Middle East. They owned land, fortresses, ships, and treasuries. Kings borrowed from them. Popes granted them extraordinary privileges. They answered to no local authority, only to the Pope himself. This sudden rise has always troubled historians. How did a group sworn to poverty become one of the wealthiest institutions in Europe? How did warriors acquire influence normally reserved for royalty? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what allowed the Church to trust them so completely, while later accusing them of heresy? The answer may lie not in what the Templars did openly, but in what they were allowed to do in secret. The Templars were not simply fighters. They were administrators. They created one of the earliest forms of international banking, allowing pilgrims and nobles to deposit money in one location and withdraw it in another. This required precise record-keeping, encryption, and trust. It also required advanced knowledge of mathematics, knowledge not commonly taught in medieval Europe. Their financial system alone suggests a level of intellectual sophistication far beyond that of typical knightly orders. But money was only one aspect of their power. The Templars were master builders. Their churches and fortresses followed precise geometric layouts. Many were aligned with the rising or setting sun on specific days of the year. Some alignments appear accidental, others disturbingly precise. Patterns emerge only when viewed collectively, as if they were part of a larger design rather than isolated constructions. Geometry, in medieval thought, was sacred. It was believed to reflect the mind of God. Circles, squares, and ratios were not aesthetic choices. They were spiritual tools. To build with geometry was to inscribe divine order into stone. And the Templars built obsessively, repeating certain proportions again and again, across regions separated by thousands of miles. This consistency hints at centralized knowledge. Where did it come from? The Templars' headquarters in Jerusalem offers a clue. For nearly 2 decades, they were stationed on the Temple Mount, directly above the ruins of Solomon's Temple. Officially, they were guarding the sacred site. Unofficially, legends insist they were excavating beneath it. These legends never faded. Whispers spoke of underground chambers, sealed vaults, and forgotten archives. Ancient Hebrew texts, Babylonian star charts, pre-Christian relics linked to astronomy and sacred timekeeping. Whether all of these stories are true is less important than the fact that they persist, because persistence itself suggests something was hidden. The Temple of Solomon was not merely a religious structure. According to biblical and extra-biblical sources, it was aligned with celestial events. Its rituals followed lunar and solar calendars. It functioned, in many ways, as a cosmological instrument. If the Templars uncovered knowledge related to this system, it would explain much. It would explain why they showed such interest in architecture and alignment, why their symbols included stars, circles, and intersecting lines, why their seals often depicted duality, two knights on one horse, light and dark, seen and unseen. The Templars lived in two worlds. In public, they were defenders of Christendom. In private, they were keepers of knowledge that blurred the line between faith and cosmic order. They studied not only scripture, but time itself. This dual role made them indispensable and dangerous. Kings relied on them to manage finances and secure territories. The church relied on them to fight holy wars. But both also feared them. An organization that transcended borders, answered to no crown, and possessed knowledge that others did not was inherently destabilizing. Still, for a time, the benefits outweighed the risk. The Templars were granted privileges unheard of for their era. They could build their own churches. They were exempt from local laws. They could collect taxes and transport wealth without interference. They were trusted with relics and secrets others were never allowed to see. And with that trust came access. Access to libraries forbidden to ordinary monks. Access to scholars from multiple cultures. Access to ancient knowledge filtered through centuries of conquest and translation. Knowledge that spoke not just of God, but of cycles, of rise and fall, creation and destruction. Over time, the Templars began to resemble something closer to an ancient mystery school than a military order. Initiation rituals, secrecy, layered hierarchy, all hallmarks of esoteric traditions, became central to their identity. New members were sworn to silence. Symbols replaced words. Meaning was hidden in gesture and geometry rather than scripture alone. This secrecy later became the foundation of the accusations against them. When the Templars fell from favor, their silence was interpreted as guilt. Their symbols were labeled heretical. Their knowledge was framed as witchcraft. But secrecy does not imply evil. Often, it implies survival. Because knowledge can be dangerous. To understand cycles of history is to understand that no power lasts forever. To study the sky is to realize that human authority is temporary. And to possess such understanding while serving kings and popes creates an unbearable tension. By the early 14th century, that tension reached its breaking point. The Templars were wealthy, influential, and independent. Europe was unstable. Monarchies were desperate for funds. The church faced growing criticism. And somewhere within this volatile mix existed knowledge. Knowledge tied to eclipses, cycles, and endings. Knowledge that could not be allowed to circulate freely. The rise of the Knights Templar was not an accident of history. It was the emergence of an order uniquely positioned to inherit ancient wisdom and apply it to a medieval world unprepared for its implications. They were warriors, yes. They were bankers, certainly. But beneath armor and ledgers, they were something else entirely. They were watchers of time. And as the Red Eclipse loomed in their calculations, the question was no longer whether history would change, but whether they would survive knowing when it would happen. Jerusalem has always been a city layered upon itself. Every conquest built over the ruins of the last. Every sacred structure resting on foundations far older than the faith that claimed it. To walk its streets is to walk across centuries compressed into stone. But the true secrets of Jerusalem were never meant to be seen in daylight. They were buried, intentionally, beneath the city's surface. When the Knights Templar arrived in Jerusalem in the early 12th century, they were granted quarters on the Temple Mount, a location sacred beyond measure. Officially, this was an honor, a sign of trust from the church and the ruling authorities. Unofficially, it placed them directly above one of the most mysterious sites in human history, the remains of Solomon's Temple. This was no coincidence. Solomon's Temple was not merely a place of worship. According to ancient Jewish tradition, It was a center of cosmic order. Its design mirrored the structure of the universe. Its rituals followed precise lunar and solar calendars. Even its measurements were symbolic, reflecting sacred ratios believed to govern creation itself. To ancient scholars, the temple was a bridge between heaven and earth. And beneath it, according to legend, lay knowledge older than the temple itself. The Templars were not archaeologists in the modern sense, but they understood the value of what lay hidden. They had time, they had access, and most importantly, they had secrecy. For nearly 2 decades, they lived and worked on the Temple Mount, an extraordinary privilege no other order enjoyed. During this time, persistent rumors began to circulate. Stories of tunnels carved beneath the mount, of sealed chambers opened after centuries of silence, of scrolls wrapped in decaying linen, inscribed with symbols unfamiliar to medieval Europe. These rumors were never officially acknowledged, and that silence only made them more compelling. Some accounts claim the Templars discovered Hebrew manuscripts predating the Second Temple period. Others speak of Babylonian star charts brought to Jerusalem after the exile. Still others suggest even older origins, texts inherited from civilizations that predated recorded history, preserved and hidden to survive conquest after conquest. Whether every detail is true matters less than one undeniable fact. The Templars were suddenly in possession of knowledge that changed them. They began building differently, thinking differently, organizing differently. Their architecture took on a precision that mirrored astronomical principles. Their symbols became layered, referencing not only Christian imagery, but celestial patterns. Their rituals, whispered about by outsiders, seemed to hint at initiations based on hidden understanding rather than blind faith. If the Templars had indeed uncovered libraries beneath Jerusalem, these were not libraries as we imagine them today. They were repositories of forbidden continuity, records meant to survive catastrophe, knowledge designed not to enlighten the masses, but to endure the collapse of civilizations. Ancient cultures understood something modern society struggles to accept, that civilizations fall, but cycles continue. Knowledge must therefore be hidden, encoded, and protected, not celebrated openly. This philosophy aligns perfectly with what the Templars became. The libraries beneath Jerusalem, according to legend, contained texts describing time as cyclical rather than linear. Ages rose and fell in repeating patterns governed by celestial mechanics. Eclipses were not accidents, they were checkpoints, moments when the cycle reset or shifted direction. Among these, the Red Eclipse held special significance. Texts attributed to ancient Near Eastern astronomer priests warned of eclipses where the sun would darken and glow red, a result of atmospheric conditions and precise celestial alignment. These events were said to coincide with the collapse of dynasties, the fall of sacred cities, and the breakdown of moral order. To ancient observers, the sky was not causing these events. It was announcing them. If the Templars encountered such texts beneath the Temple Mount, it would explain why they treated eclipses not with fear, but with gravity, why they recorded dates obsessively, why they aligned structures with the sun and stars. They were not worshiping the heavens. They were tracking time itself. This knowledge would have been considered heretical by the Church. Christian doctrine emphasized divine will and moral causation. History unfolded according to God's judgment, not mechanical cycles. To suggest otherwise, to imply that collapse followed predictable astronomical patterns, undermined the very foundation of religious authority. And yet, the Church allowed the Templars to remain. Why? Perhaps because the knowledge was too dangerous to destroy outright. Perhaps because it could be useful. Or perhaps because the Church itself did not fully understand what the Templars had found. The Temple Mount was not the only site connected to these hidden libraries. Legends claim the Templars quietly transported select manuscripts out of Jerusalem before its fall. These texts traveled with them across the Mediterranean, disappearing into European commanderies, monasteries, and vaults. Some were copied. Others were encoded into stone. A diagram carved into a church wall. a floor pattern aligned with a solstice sunrise, a seal bearing a star whose points corresponded to known eclipse cycles. To the untrained eye, these were decorations. To those who knew, they were instructions. The libraries beneath Jerusalem may no longer exist, destroyed, sealed, or scattered, but their influence remains. It is visible in the sudden leap in European architectural sophistication, in the emergence of precise calendars, in the quiet obsession with timekeeping that followed the Templars' rise. Even after their destruction, fragments of this knowledge resurfaced. Renaissance scholars marveled at ancient astronomical texts that seemed to appear from nowhere. Builders aligned cathedrals with uncanny accuracy. Secret societies emerged, obsessed with symbols, cycles, and hidden history. None of this can be definitively traced back to a single chamber beneath Jerusalem. But patterns do not need certainty to be meaningful. The true power of the hidden libraries lies not in proving their existence, but in understanding why their story refuses to die. Because it speaks to something deeply uncomfortable, that history is not a straight path of progress, but a spiral. That humanity has faced collapse before and prepared for it. The Templars were not trying to bring about the end. They were trying to remember it. By preserving knowledge across generations, by hiding it beneath layers of faith and stone, they acted as custodians of continuity. They believed that when the sky darkened and the sun turned red again, someone would need to understand what it meant. Someone would need the old warnings. Someone would need the maps. And somewhere beneath Jerusalem, or perhaps within the structures built far from it, those warnings were hidden, waiting not for the medieval world, but for a future that would once again look up at a darkened sun and wonder whether history was repeating itself. Long before medieval Europe trembled beneath darkened skies, long before the Knights Templar ever set foot in Jerusalem, the Red Eclipse already existed in human memory. It was not born in Christian scripture, nor did it originate in medieval fear. Its roots reach far deeper, into the earliest civilizations that learned to watch the heavens not with wonder, but with suspicion. The oldest known records of eclipses come from Mesopotamia, carved into clay tablets thousands of years before Christ. These were not poetic reflections or religious hymns. They were warnings, lists, omen catalogs. Babylonian priest astronomers believed the sky was a language, and eclipses were its most dangerous words. In these texts, eclipses were rarely neutral events. A darkened sun signaled the death of a king. A blood-red moon warned of rebellion or famine. But among all recorded phenomena, eclipses where the sun appeared stained red were treated with exceptional gravity. These were not simply signs of misfortune. They marked transitions between eras. To the ancient mind, time did not progress forward endlessly. It moved in great cycles. Civilizations rose, decayed, collapsed, and were reborn. The heavens, moving in predictable patterns, were believed to mirror these cycles. When the sky deviated from its normal rhythm, when day turned briefly into night, it was interpreted as a reset point, a moment when fate itself could change direction. This belief was not confined to Mesopotamia. In ancient Egypt, eclipses were associated with the temporary defeat of Ra, the sun god. While official theology emphasized his inevitable victory, hidden priestly texts suggested that these moments weakened divine order, allowing chaos, represented by the serpent Apep, to rise. A red or darkened sun symbolized bloodshed and disorder spilling into the human world. In early Hebrew tradition, eclipses carried similar weight. While the Hebrew Bible rarely describes eclipses directly, prophetic texts are filled with imagery of the sun turning dark and the moon becoming blood. These were not metaphors for personal suffering. They described collective upheaval, exile, destruction of temples, the fall of nations. Crucially, these passages often frame eclipses as announcements, not punishments. They precede judgment rather than cause it. This distinction matters. It suggests that ancient prophets saw eclipses as markers in time, signals that a preordained phase of history was ending. Further east, ancient Chinese astronomers tracked eclipses with meticulous care. Imperial records describe eclipses as threats to the mandate of heaven, the divine authority granting emperors the right to rule. When eclipses occurred, especially unusual ones, rituals were performed to protect the emperor. In some cases, substitute kings were temporarily installed to absorb the predicted disaster. The implication was clear: eclipses endangered power. Across cultures that never communicated directly, the same idea emerged. When the sun darkened, authority weakened. Order fractured. Change followed. What makes the red eclipse distinct is that it appears in prophecies tied not to single events, but to long-term cycles. Ancient texts describe certain eclipses as ordinary, troubling but manageable. Others, however, are described as great signs, occurring at rare intervals, often centuries apart. These were the eclipses that mattered most. In some apocryphal Jewish texts, eclipses are linked to the concept of ages, long periods of human history governed by specific moral and spiritual conditions. The end of an age was not instantaneous. It unfolded through escalating disorder, beginning with signs in the heavens. Similar ideas appear in Zoroastrian cosmology, where time unfolds in vast epochs marked by cosmic struggle. Certain celestial events signal the weakening of truth and the rise of chaos before eventual renewal. Though eclipses are not always named directly, descriptions of a darkened sun and corrupted light strongly resemble them. Even in early Greek thought, eclipses carried philosophical weight. While thinkers like Aristotle sought natural explanations, popular belief persisted that eclipses accompanied the deaths of great leaders or the collapse of states. Plutarch wrote of armies paralyzed by fear during eclipses, interpreting them as divine disapproval. What unites all these traditions is not superstition, but pattern recognition. Ancient observers noticed that eclipses clustered around moments of instability. Wars, revolutions, natural disasters. Over generations, this observation hardened into prophecy. Not because people believed the sky caused events, but because it seemed to announce them. This distinction is crucial to understanding why such knowledge was later suppressed. If eclipses merely frightened people, they could be dismissed as primitive fear. But if eclipses were understood as reliable markers of historical transition, then those who could predict them possessed a dangerous advantage. They could anticipate collapse. They could prepare, or they could manipulate belief itself. This is where ancient prophecy intersects with the later actions of the Knights Templar. The prophecies surrounding the Red Eclipse were never simple predictions of destruction. They were warnings encoded in symbol and ritual, meant to be interpreted by those trained to understand cycles. Knowledge was passed not through public sermons, but through initiations, symbols, and restricted texts. In Mesopotamia, eclipse knowledge was restricted to priestly elites. In Egypt, it was guarded within temple cults. In Israel, it was filtered through prophetic tradition. In China, it was monopolized by the imperial court. Knowledge of the sky was power. By the time this knowledge filtered into medieval Europe through translations, trade, and conquest, it was already fragmented. Pieces survive, but rarely in full. A line here, a symbol there, a date without explanation. Only those with access to multiple traditions could begin to reconstruct the original meaning. The Templars, uniquely positioned between cultures, were among the few who could attempt this reconstruction. They encountered Islamic astronomers who preserved Greek and Persian texts. They interacted with Jewish scholars who carried ancient interpretive traditions. They studied Christian scripture layered atop older cosmologies. Over time, a pattern would have emerged, one that echoed the ancient warnings. Certain eclipses were not random. They aligned with turning points in history. The Red Eclipse, in particular, appeared in texts describing the fall of cities, the corruption of institutions, and the loss of spiritual authority. It did not mark the end of the world, but the end of a world, a specific order, a specific age. This understanding reframes medieval fear entirely. People feared eclipses because they sensed instability. They feared loss. They feared judgment. But those who studied ancient prophecy feared something else: inevitability. If cycles govern history, then moral reform alone could not prevent collapse. It could only shape what followed. This idea was deeply unsettling to religious authorities who preached repentance as salvation from disaster. Prophecy became dangerous not because it predicted doom, but because it limited choice. And so, over centuries, the deeper interpretations of eclipse prophecy were buried beneath theology and superstition. What survived publicly were verses about punishment and fear. What vanished were discussions of cycles, timing, and preparation. Yet traces remain. They survive in architecture aligned with eclipses, in symbols carved into stone, in whispered legends of secret orders who watched the sky not in terror, but in silence. The red eclipse in ancient prophecy was never meant to frighten the masses. It was meant to warn the watchers. Those who understood that when the sun turned red, it was not God shouting. It was time turning a page. At some point, ancient prophecy crossed a dangerous threshold. It stopped being purely symbolic and became mathematical. This transition marked the moment when knowledge of the heavens evolved from fearful interpretation into calculated certainty. And it was here, in numbers rather than prayers, that the red eclipse became truly forbidden. To calculate an eclipse is to strip it of mystery. To predict 1 century in advance is to challenge the idea that the heavens operate solely by divine whim. In the ancient world, this knowledge was never shared freely. It was guarded, restricted, and often hidden behind ritual language, because its implications were unsettling. If the sky could be calculated, then so could the moments of disruption tied to it. The earliest eclipse calculations were crude, but effective. Babylonian astronomers discovered repeating cycles, most notably the Saros cycle, which allowed them to predict eclipses roughly every 18 years. Over generations, these calculations grew more refined. Tables expanded, corrections were added, patterns deepened. But there was a second layer of calculation that rarely appears in mainstream history. Some ancient texts did not merely predict eclipses. They categorized them. They distinguished between ordinary eclipses and those that occurred at specific intersections of solar, lunar, and planetary cycles. These rare alignments were believed to amplify the eclipse's significance. When atmospheric conditions were right, the sun would not simply darken. It would glow red, filtered through dust, smoke, or volcanic residue. To ancient observers, this was blood in the sky. These eclipses were marked differently. Symbols were added, warnings intensified, and dates were often left deliberately incomplete, as if the authors feared the knowledge being misused. This selective secrecy suggests intent. The calculations associated with red eclipses were not purely astronomical. They combined observation with numerology, sacred geometry, and time cycles measured not in years, but in ages. Ancient scholars believed time itself had structure, rhythms that governed not just celestial motion, but human history. This idea persisted quietly into the medieval period. By the 12th century, Europe had regained access to advanced mathematical knowledge through Arabic translations of Greek and Persian works. Astronomy and astrology were still intertwined. To calculate planetary motion was also to interpret meaning. Universities taught astronomy as part of the quadrivium, alongside arithmetic, geometry, and music, all disciplines concerned with harmony and proportion. But what was taught publicly was only part of the picture. Private scholars worked on more complex models. They attempted to reconcile Christian theology with ancient cyclical views of time. They studied calendars not just for religious festivals, but for long-term patterns. And among the orders most deeply involved in this work were the Knights Templar. The Templars had both motive and means to engage in forbidden calculation. They traveled widely. They interacted with Islamic astronomers who preserved eclipse tables unknown in Europe. They had access to Jewish calendrical traditions that tracked lunar cycles with extreme precision. And they possessed the organizational discipline required to maintain records across generations. Most importantly, they had patience. Calculations involving centuries require continuity. A single lifetime is not enough. Data must be preserved, corrected, and passed on. Few medieval institutions could support such long-term projects. The Templars, with their centralized structure and secrecy, were uniquely suited to the task. Legends suggest that within the order existed a small inner circle tasked with maintaining these calculations. They were not prophets in the religious sense. They were custodians of timekeeping knowledge. Their work was not meant to predict the future in detail, but to identify thresholds, moments when history became unstable. The Red Eclipse was one such threshold. In these forbidden calculations, time was not linear. It was segmented. Certain periods were marked by growth and consolidation, others by decay and fragmentation. These phases were believed to correspond with celestial cycles, especially those involving eclipses occurring at precise nodal intersections. When a red eclipse appeared at the end of a cycle, it was interpreted as confirmation that a transition was underway. This was not framed as divine punishment. It was framed as inevitability. Such a conclusion was profoundly threatening. If collapse followed mathematical patterns, then prayer alone could not prevent it. Kings could not rule indefinitely. Churches could not claim eternal authority. The idea that history obeyed cycles rather than morality undermined the ideological foundations of medieval power. This is why the calculations were forbidden. Not officially condemned, perhaps, but never acknowledged publicly. Scholars who pursued such work risked accusations of astrology, heresy, or worse. The line between acceptable astronomy and condemned divination was thin and constantly shifting. The Templars walked this line carefully. They framed their interest in the heavens as practical, navigation, calendar alignment, liturgical precision. But beneath these justifications lay deeper calculations, ones that tied celestial events to societal change. Evidence of this survives only indirectly. Certain Templar sites align with rare eclipse paths, not just solstices or equinoxes, but specific solar trajectories that occur only at long intervals. Some structures appear oriented towards sunrise or sunset on dates associated with known historical upheavals. These alignments are too precise to be accidental. They suggest foreknowledge. The use of sacred geometry reinforces this idea. Ratios such as the golden mean appear repeatedly in Templar architecture. These ratios were believed to reflect cosmic order. When used deliberately, they transformed buildings into symbolic models of the universe, frozen calculations in stone. In this context, architecture became a form of data storage. Numbers encoded as proportions, dates embedded in alignments, warnings preserved without words. This method of encoding knowledge made it resilient. Books could be burned. Manuscripts could be confiscated, but stone endured. The Red Eclipse calculations, if they existed in written form, were likely fragmented deliberately. Complete tables would have been too dangerous to possess. Instead, pieces were distributed. Symbols replaced numbers. Meaning was layered to ensure that only those with full context could reconstruct the whole. This practice mirrors ancient traditions. In Babylon, eclipse knowledge was divided among priestly ranks. In Egypt, astronomical secrets were tied to temple initiations. Knowledge was never centralized in one place, because centralization invited destruction. The Templars appear to have adopted the same strategy. When their order was later targeted, much of this knowledge vanished from written record, but its absence speaks loudly. Gaps appear in trial transcripts. References to astronomical study are vague or dismissed. Confessions extracted under torture mention strange rituals, but never explain them. It is as if something was deliberately avoided, perhaps because the accusers did not fully understand what they were destroying, or perhaps because they understood it too well. The idea that time operates in cycles governed by the heavens remains deeply uncomfortable even today. Modern science acknowledges celestial mechanics, but resists linking them to human affairs. History is framed as contingent, driven by politics and chance. Yet patterns persist. Periods of stability followed by collapse. repeated social breakdowns, recurring crises that seem to cluster rather than distribute evenly. When viewed through the lens of ancient calculation, these patterns resemble cycles rather than accidents. The forbidden calculation was never about predicting the end of the world. It was about recognizing when one world ends and another begins. The red eclipse was not the cause. It was the signal. And those who calculated its timing understood something that power structures have always feared: that control is temporary, cycles are relentless, and no civilization escapes time itself. The Knights Templar may have been destroyed for many reasons: wealth, politics, envy. But the knowledge they carried, encoded in numbers and stone, represented a deeper threat. They knew when the sky would darken, and they knew what usually followed. When knowledge becomes too dangerous to speak aloud, it seeks another form. It hides in symbols, proportions, rituals, and silence. For the Knights Templar, secrecy was not merely a matter of survival. It was a necessity dictated by the nature of what they knew. If the red eclipse and its cycles marked the turning points of history, then that knowledge could not exist openly. It had to be encoded. This is where the Templar cipher begins. Unlike modern codes made of letters and numbers, the Templar cipher was architectural, symbolic, and layered. It did not rely on a single key, but on understanding. To those without context, it appeared meaningless or decorative. To those initiated, it conveyed information across generations without leaving a written confession. Symbols were the first layer. The Templars used imagery that seemed overtly Christian: crosses, lambs, saints, and biblical scenes. But beneath these familiar forms lay older meanings. Stars appeared subtly carved into stone. Circles intersected with crosses in precise ratios. Repeating patterns emerged across sites separated by vast distances. One of the most curious symbols associated with the Templars is the eight-pointed star. Officially, it represented regeneration or Christ's resurrection. But in astronomical tradition, eight-pointed stars often marked significant solar or lunar cycles. In some ancient systems, 8 represented completion, the end of a phase before renewal. When such symbols appear repeatedly in Templar sites aligned with specific celestial events, coincidence becomes difficult to maintain. Then there is geometry. Templar churches often follow layouts that deviate from standard ecclesiastical design. Their proportions are deliberate. Measurements repeat across regions. Ratios align with sacred geometry known to reflect cosmic order. These were not aesthetic preferences. They were mathematical choices. Geometry allowed the Templars to encode information without words. A building aligned to the sunrise on a specific date becomes a marker in time. A doorway positioned to frame the sun during an eclipse becomes a silent witness to prediction. These structures did not announce their purpose. They waited. Stone, unlike parchment, does not confess under torture. The cipher extended beyond architecture into ritual. Outsiders accused the Templars of strange initiation ceremonies, secret words, and gestures that made no sense to medieval inquisitors. These accusations were framed as heresy, but they reveal something else: a language of symbols misunderstood by those without the key. Ritual gestures can encode instruction. Words can carry multiple meanings. Silence itself can be a form of transmission. In esoteric traditions, knowledge is not given directly. It is revealed gradually, tested through understanding rather than obedience. If the Templars believed they were custodians of cyclical knowledge, warnings meant for future generations, then ritual was the perfect medium. It ensured continuity without exposure. Maps form another layer of the cipher. Certain Templar sites, when plotted geographically, form patterns. Lines connecting them align with solstices, equinoxes, and in some theories, eclipse paths. These alignments are not exact enough to satisfy modern engineering standards, but they are precise enough to suggest intent rather than chance. This form of encoding transforms geography into memory. A network of sites becomes a calendar. A landscape becomes a record. Anyone with enough pieces could reconstruct the larger pattern, but only if they knew what to look for. This distributed encoding explains why no single manuscript survives detailing the Red Eclipse Prophecy in full. Centralized knowledge invites destruction. Fragmented knowledge endures. The Templars understood this instinctively. Their cipher was not meant to be solved quickly. It was meant to survive collapse, to be rediscovered slowly by those living in a different age, an age perhaps approaching the same threshold. Symbols tied to duality appear repeatedly in Templar imagery. Two knights on one horse, light and shadow, seen and unseen. These were not just vows of poverty. They reflected a worldview in which reality itself operated on two levels: the surface narrative and the hidden structure beneath it. History, in this view, also has two layers. One layer consists of kings, wars, and doctrine. The other consists of cycles, timing, and inevitability. The Templar cipher existed to preserve the second layer, while the first changed repeatedly. This may explain why later secret societies claimed descent from the Templars. Groups such as the Freemasons adopted similar symbolic languages: geometry, architecture, ritual, silence. Whether these groups inherited direct knowledge or merely fragments is debated, but the continuity of method is undeniable. Encoding knowledge in symbol allows it to bypass censorship. A church aligned to an eclipse does not declare prophecy. A symbol carved into stone does not accuse authority. But together, across centuries, they tell a story to those prepared to listen. The cipher also explains the strange restraint of the Templars. Despite their power, they did not seize thrones. They did not preach apocalypse. They did not attempt to alter the course of history openly. They observed. They preserved. They encoded. To interfere directly would have been pointless if cycles were immutable. Their role was not to stop the turning of the wheel, but to ensure that memory survived each revolution. This restraint likely contributed to their downfall. Kings saw wealth and independence. The church saw secrecy. Neither fully understood the deeper layer of meaning behind Templar practices, but both sensed a threat, an order that knew too much and spoke too little. When the Templars were accused, their cipher protected them in one crucial way. It left no single piece of evidence that could expose the whole truth. Confessions extracted under torture were incoherent. Symbols were misinterpreted. Rituals were mocked or condemned without understanding. The cipher worked, but it also ensured that much of the knowledge would be lost, at least temporarily. Only fragments survived. A church here, a symbol there, a legend whispered centuries later. Alone, each fragment means little. Together, they suggest a hidden continuity, a thread running beneath official history. The Templar cipher was never about secrecy for its own sake. It was about timing. Knowledge revealed too early would cause panic. Knowledge revealed too late would be useless. The cipher allowed information to wait patiently until conditions were right. Perhaps those conditions have not yet been fully met, or perhaps we are approaching them now. When viewed through this lens, the Red Eclipse Prophecy was not erased. It was disguised, folded into stone, symbol, and silence, protected from both belief and disbelief. Because the most enduring knowledge is not the loudest. It is the knowledge that knows how to hide and when to return. The morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, did not begin with thunder or celestial fire. There was no eclipse in the sky, no omen visible to the common people. And yet, by the end of that day, one of the most powerful and mysterious institutions in medieval Europe had been shattered almost overnight. The Knights Templar were arrested en masse, their leaders seized, their properties confiscated, and their name dragged into infamy. Official history presents this event as a calculated political move. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars, orchestrated their downfall with the cooperation of Pope Clement V. Charges of heresy, blasphemy, and corruption were levied. Confessions were extracted under torture. The order was dissolved. Case closed. But this explanation, while convenient, leaves too many questions unanswered. Why such urgency? Why such secrecy? And why that date? Friday the 13th has since become synonymous with misfortune, but this association did not exist before 1307. It was born from this moment. A day chosen not at random, but with intent. A day loaded with symbolism, fear, and psychological impact. The arrests were meticulously planned. Sealed orders were sent across France to be opened simultaneously. No warning was given. No negotiation attempted. It was as if the decision had already been made, irreversible. The Templars were not to be questioned. They were to be erased. This level of coordination suggests panic rather than patience. Something had changed. Up until this point, the Templars had weathered criticism before. They were envied, resented, even feared, but tolerated. Their usefulness outweighed suspicion. So what transformed them overnight into enemies of the state and church? One answer lies in timing. By the early 14th century, Europe was approaching a period of extreme instability. Climate anomalies were beginning to affect harvests. Financial systems were strained. Political tensions simmered beneath the surface. Within decades, famine, plague, and war would ravage the continent. Those in power may not have known exactly what was coming, but some may have sensed it. And the Templars, according to persistent theories, may have known far more. If the order possessed calculations or prophecies pointing toward a coming cycle of collapse, marked by celestial signs such as the Red Eclipse, then their silence would have been threatening. Knowledge that predicts instability undermines authority, even if it is never spoken aloud. A king in debt to such an order would not simply fear financial ruin. He would fear loss of legitimacy. King Philip IV was not a superstitious man, but he was deeply aware of symbolism. He had clashed with the papacy before. He understood the power of belief. To him, the Templars represented not just an economic rival, but a parallel authority, one that answered to knowledge rather than crowns. The Church, too, faced a dilemma. If the Templars carried knowledge suggesting that history followed cycles beyond moral correction, then core theological claims were at risk. The Church's power rested on the belief that repentance could avert disaster, that divine judgment was responsive to human behavior. A prophecy grounded in calculation, not morality, threatened that framework. It is notable that the charges against the Templars focused less on their actions and more on their secrecy. Strange rituals, hidden symbols, forbidden knowledge. These accusations mirror what happens when authorities confront something they do not understand. Rather than debate it, they destroy it. The trials themselves were theatrical. Confessions were inconsistent. Evidence was circumstantial, but the outcome was predetermined. The order had to be dissolved completely, not reformed, not absorbed. This total erasure suggests that the danger posed by the Templars was not logistical, but existential. And then there is the question of records. Many Templar archives vanished during this period. Financial documents disappeared. Correspondence was destroyed. Some properties were transferred hastily to other orders. Whatever knowledge the Templars possessed, it fragmented rapidly after their arrest. This fragmentation mirrors the collapse of other knowledge systems during times of upheaval. If the Red Eclipse Prophecy or its calculations existed in written form, this was the moment they were scattered, hidden, or lost. But not entirely, because total destruction was impossible. The Templars had prepared for this. Their cipher, embedded in stone, symbol, and ritual, ensured that even if the order fell, fragments of knowledge would survive. The suddenness of the arrests may indicate that authorities feared the knowledge would spread if they waited. Friday the 13th was chosen not just for logistics, but for symbolism. It marked betrayal, sudden reversal, the inversion of trust. It transformed the Templars from protectors into pariahs in a single stroke. This psychological shock ensured public support, or at least public silence. But beneath the spectacle lay a deeper fear. What if the Templars had reached a conclusion about the timing of collapse? What if calculations tied to celestial cycles suggested that Europe was entering a dangerous phase? Such knowledge would have been intolerable. It would explain why the Templars were not merely arrested, but vilified, why their reputation had to be destroyed alongside their infrastructure. A respected order could pass knowledge quietly. A disgraced one could not. After the arrests, Europe did not become safer. Within a generation, the Great Famine struck. Crop failures killed millions. Soon after, the Black Death would devastate the continent, killing nearly a third of its population. Wars intensified. Social structures weakened. Faith in institutions eroded. To later generations, these disasters appeared sudden and inexplicable. But to those who watched the sky and studied cycles, they may have appeared anticipated. Friday the 13th, then, was not the end of the story. It was the moment when prophecy became dangerous enough to suppress. The Templars had crossed an invisible line, not by rebellion, but by knowing too much at the wrong time. Their destruction was not just an act of greed or fear. It was an attempt to sever continuity, to break the chain of memory. Yet history rarely allows knowledge to disappear completely. Traces survived in architecture, in symbols adopted by later groups, in legends whispered centuries later. The fear associated with Friday the 13th itself is a kind of cultural residue, an echo of the shock inflicted on that day. The sky did not darken on October 13th, 1307, but something else did. Trust collapsed, order fractured, and a civilization began sliding into one of the darkest periods in its history. If the Red Eclipse marked transitions between ages, then Friday the 13th marked the moment when those who knew chose, or were forced, into silence. Not because the prophecy was false, but because it was coming true. After the arrests of the Knights Templar, something far quieter and far more permanent began to unfold. While prisons filled and trials dominated public attention, another process took place behind sealed doors and guarded corridors. It did not involve torture or confession. It involved ink, parchment, and silence. The rewriting of memory had begun. The Vatican archives were, and still are, among the most extensive repositories of written knowledge in the world. Papal correspondence, trial records, theological debates, political agreements, all passed through Rome. If the truth about the Templars and their knowledge existed anywhere in written form, fragments of it would have reached these archives. And yet, when historians began examining the surviving documents centuries later, they noticed something unsettling. There were gaps. Entire years missing from correspondence. Trial records that referenced documents no longer present. Letters that abruptly ended mid-sentence. Mentions of texts, charts, or testimonies that could no longer be found. The destruction of the Templars was thoroughly documented, but the reasoning behind it was strangely thin. This absence is not accidental. Institutions preserve what supports them and remove what threatens them. The Vatican, like any power structure, curated its memory. Knowledge that reinforced doctrine was copied and protected. Knowledge that challenged it quietly vanished. The trial records themselves offer clues. Charges against the Templars were remarkably vague. Accusations of idol worship, secret rituals, and blasphemy lacked concrete detail. When astronomical study is mentioned, if at all, it is dismissed as superstition or curiosity. Yet outside these records, independent sources suggest the Templars were deeply engaged with timekeeping, calendars, and celestial alignment. Why was this aspect minimized? Because acknowledging it would have raised dangerous questions. If the Templars were studying celestial cycles, then their fall might appear less like punishment for heresy and more like suppression of knowledge. That narrative would undermine the Church's moral authority and expose its fear. Some Vatican documents hint at discomfort. Papal letters reveal hesitation. Pope Clement V delayed condemning the Templars outright. He expressed doubts about the evidence. He resisted King Philip's pressure briefly. This hesitation suggests uncertainty, not conviction. Something complicated the decision. Later documents show the shift in tone. Authority hardens. Language becomes decisive. Doubt disappears. It is as if a threshold was crossed, a decision made that could not be reversed. Historians debate whether the shift was political or theological. But the selective erasure of information suggests something more. When entire categories of knowledge disappear, not just documents, but references to them. It implies intent, especially when that knowledge aligns with themes the church sought to control: prophecy, time, and the end of ages. The church was no stranger to prophecy. It embraced certain apocalyptic narratives while rejecting others. The difference lay in control. Approved prophecy reinforced obedience. Forbidden prophecy undermined it. A prophecy tied to celestial calculation rather than divine revelation would have been especially problematic. It removed moral agency from the equation. It suggested that no amount of prayer could change the timing of collapse. Such an idea was unacceptable. Thus, references to astronomical cycles and eclipse interpretation were either reframed as harmless astrology or erased entirely. Surviving texts emphasize moral failure rather than cosmic timing. History was rewritten as a story of sin and punishment, not cycles and inevitability. Even when documents survived, they were often altered. Marginal notes were removed, diagrams erased, numbers scratched out. In some cases, pages were replaced with summaries that stripped away detail. The original meaning vanished, leaving behind sanitized fragments. This process was not unique to the Templars. Throughout history, institutions have managed knowledge this way. What makes the Templar case distinctive is how thorough the erasure appears to be. It suggests fear rather than mere censorship. If the Red Eclipse Prophecy existed in a coherent form, this was the moment it was broken apart. Pieces may have survived elsewhere, in private collections, monasteries beyond papal reach, or encoded into architecture, but its centralized narrative was destroyed. This destruction created a vacuum. In the absence of clear records, myths flourished. Accusations grew more elaborate over time. The Templars became villains, heretics, devil worshippers. These stories served a purpose. They distracted from what had actually been lost. Public attention shifted from knowledge to scandal. Meanwhile, the Vatican archives remained sealed to outsiders for centuries. When partial access was granted in the modern era, historians hoped to uncover clarity. Instead, they found ambiguity. Documents hinted at missing materials without explaining their contents. Some archivists acknowledged privately that not everything survived. Fires, wars, and decay account for some losses, but not all. The pattern of disappearance aligns too closely with sensitive topics. Knowledge related to time cycles, astronomy, and prophecy is consistently underrepresented. This absence speaks volumes. Silence, in this case, is not neutrality. It is a record of fear. Fear that if people understood the cyclical nature of history, they would stop believing in permanent authority. Fear that institutions built on continuity would be exposed as temporary. The erasure from the Vatican archives was not about hiding the past. It was about controlling the future. By shaping how history was remembered, the Church shaped how people imagined what lay ahead. Without knowledge of cycles, collapse appears random. Without patterns, disaster feels sudden. And, without warning, people turn to authority for explanation. The Templars' knowledge, if preserved, would have offered a different response. Preparation instead of panic. Understanding instead of fear. That alternative could not be allowed. And yet, the erasure was never complete. Some documents slipped through cracks. Some copies survived outside papal reach. Some ideas re-emerged centuries later, stripped of their original context, but recognizable in structure. Renaissance scholars rediscovered ancient astronomical texts and marveled at their precision. Secret societies adopted symbolic languages eerily similar to Templar methods. Architecture continued to encode time and alignment long after the order's destruction. These are not accidents. They are residues. The Vatican archives may have erased the narrative, but they could not erase the influence. Knowledge once known leaves traces even when suppressed. The Red Eclipse Prophecy, if it existed as a unified warning, did not survive intact. But its fragments endured, scattered, disguised, misunderstood. And perhaps that was enough, because knowledge does not need to be whole to be powerful. It only needs to persist long enough to be rediscovered. As we move forward, the question is no longer whether something was erased. It is why those fragments still resonate, and why, centuries later, humanity remains uneasy when the sky darkens and the sun turns red. Some memories refuse to stay buried, even behind the thickest walls of an archive. When the Knights Templar were officially dissolved, history presents their story as abruptly ended. Leaders executed or imprisoned, properties seized, symbols condemned. According to the record, the order vanished. And yet, disappearance is rarely that simple, especially when knowledge is involved. Institutions can be destroyed, but continuity has a way of surviving in unexpected forms. Almost immediately after the suppression of the Templars, contradictions began to appear. Not all members were arrested. Not all properties were confiscated. Not all records were destroyed. In some regions, the transition was strangely quiet. Former Templars seemed to dissolve into local society, adopting new identities, joining other orders, or simply vanishing from documentation altogether. This uneven dissolution suggests preparation. If the Templars had anticipated their fall, and given their obsession with cycles, it is difficult to imagine they did not, then contingency plans would have existed. Knowledge would not have been centralized. Custodians would have been assigned. Transmission would have shifted from formal structure to informal networks. The question, then, is not whether the knowledge survived. It is where it went. One of the most persistent theories points toward the Freemasons. While direct evidence of organizational continuity is lacking, the symbolic parallels are striking. Both groups emphasize geometry, architecture, ritual initiation, and secrecy. Both view building as a metaphor for moral and cosmic order. Both encode knowledge rather than proclaim it. Freemasonry emerges centuries after the Templars' fall, but its sudden sophistication raises questions. Its symbols appear fully formed, as if inherited rather than invented. The use of compass and square, sacred ratios, and allegorical rituals mirrors Templar methods too closely to ignore. Whether this represents direct inheritance or parallel evolution remains debated, but the continuity of method suggests continuity of purpose. Other groups may also have carried fragments of Templar knowledge. The Rosicrucians, emerging in the early modern period, spoke of hidden wisdom preserved through secret fraternities. Their writings emphasized cycles of history, renewal, and the loss and recovery of ancient knowledge. Like the Templars, they framed themselves not as revolutionaries, but as custodians waiting for the right time. Even certain monastic orders appear to have absorbed former Templars quietly. In Portugal, the Order of Christ inherited many Templar properties and members with papal approval. This transition was unusually smooth, suggesting cooperation rather than condemnation. Portugal would later become a center of exploration, navigation, and advanced astronomical study. This is not coincidence. Navigation requires celestial knowledge. Ocean travel depends on the sky. If Templar knowledge of astronomy and cycles survived anywhere, Portugal was a likely refuge. Scotland presents another anomaly. Despite papal condemnation, Templar persecution there was minimal. Legends claim that Templars fought alongside Scottish forces at Bannockburn. Whether literal or symbolic, Scotland became fertile ground for esoteric traditions that emphasized geometry, symbolism, and hidden history. Stone circles, oddly aligned churches, and later Masonic lodges dot the landscape. These structures may not encode direct prophecy, but they suggest continuity of interest in time, alignment, and cosmic order. The survival of knowledge does not require a single lineage. It requires redundancy. Fragments passed through different groups, adapted to new contexts, stripped of explicit prophecy but retaining structure. Over time, the original meaning blurred, but the framework endured. This is how ancient knowledge survives catastrophe. Another potential refuge was the Islamic world. While the Templars were enemies in war, they were also collaborators in knowledge exchange. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded upon ancient astronomical traditions. If any written calculations or interpretation survived, copies may have existed beyond European reach. Knowledge does not respect political boundaries. It flows along trade routes, scholarly networks, and personal relationships. A single manuscript can influence generations if it survives long enough. The disappearance of explicit Red Eclipse Prophecy from mainstream history does not imply total loss. It implies transformation. Instead of prophecy, the knowledge became philosophy. Instead of warning, it became symbolism. Instead of prediction, it became pattern recognition. Later thinkers would rediscover these patterns without knowing their origin. Renaissance astronomers noticed recurring cycles of instability in history. Enlightenment philosophers wrote about the rise and fall of civilizations. Modern historians identify periods and ages without explaining why transitions cluster. These are echoes. The idea that civilizations follow rhythms remains controversial. It challenges the notion of linear progress. It suggests limits. It implies that collapse is not always preventable, only navigable. Such ideas rarely gain institutional support, but they persist. The survivors of the Templar Order may not have passed down a single document labeled the Red Eclipse Prophecy. That would have been too obvious, too dangerous. Instead, they passed down methods, ways of seeing time, interpreting the sky, encoding knowledge. They passed down restraint, the refusal to announce collapse publicly, the insistence on preservation over proclamation, the belief that knowledge must outlive institutions. This mindset can be traced through centuries of secretive scholarship. Alchemists encoded their work in allegory. Architects embedded meaning in proportion. Mystics spoke in paradox. Each method protected knowledge from those who would misuse it. The Templars did not disappear. They dispersed. Their identity dissolved, but their influence seeped into the foundations of later movements. In doing so, they ensured that the knowledge they guarded would not die with them, even if its origin was forgotten. This diffusion also explains why no single group today can claim full inheritance. Each holds a fragment, symbols without explanation, rituals without origin, alignments without recorded purpose. Together, they hint at a lost coherence, a system once unified, now scattered. The survival of the Order's knowledge, then, was not a triumph. It was a compromise. Total preservation was impossible. Total destruction was unacceptable. What remained was partial, ambiguous, and resilient. And perhaps that was intentional. Knowledge of cycles does not demand certainty. It demands awareness. Even fragments can change how people see the world. When the sky darkens, when patterns repeat, when instability clusters, those who recognize the signs respond differently. They do not panic. They remember. The Knights Templar may have been erased from power, but the knowledge they carried found new vessels. Not as an order, but as an undercurrent running beneath history. Waiting, observing, and preparing for the moment when humanity once again looks upward and asks whether the heavens are merely beautiful, or try to tell us something we once already knew. Once the fragments of ancient knowledge are placed side by side, a disturbing picture begins to form. It is not a prophecy written in dramatic language, nor a single catastrophic prediction etched into stone. It is a pattern, subtle, repetitive, and persistent across centuries. A pattern in which red eclipses appear again and again at the edges of collapse. History, when taught in isolation, feels chaotic. Empires rise for complex reasons. They fall due to corruption, invasion, or chance. Each collapse is explained as unique. But when viewed across long spans of time, certain moments cluster unervingly close to one another. Periods of stability stretch out, then suddenly fracture. And in the shadows of many of these fractures, the sky darkens. Ancient chroniclers noticed this first. Babylonian records show eclipses preceding the deaths of kings or the weakening of dynasties. Chinese imperial annals document eclipses followed by rebellion or regime change. Roman historians recorded eclipses before military disasters, assassinations, and civil wars. These accounts were not written as scientific studies, but they reveal a pattern of attention. People remembered eclipses when things went wrong. What modern historians often dismiss as superstition may, in fact, be early pattern recognition. The medieval period offers a striking example. In the decades surrounding the early 14th century, the era of the Templars' fall, Europe experienced a cascade of disasters. The Great Famine began in 1315, triggered by climate anomalies and crop failures. Entire regions starved. Social order broke down. Cannibalism was recorded in some areas. Faith in institutions weakened. Soon after, the Black Death arrived, killing millions. Wars intensified. Peasant revolts erupted. The authority of the church fractured, culminating later in the Western Schism. Europe did not simply suffer isolated crises. It entered a systemic collapse. What is often overlooked is how tightly these events clustered in time. Within less than a century, a civilization that had seemed stable for generations was transformed. And embedded within this period are several significant eclipses, including those described as unusually dark or red in contemporary accounts. Correlation is not causation, but repetition demands attention. The same clustering appears elsewhere. The fall of the Roman Republic was preceded by a series of eclipses recorded with alarm. The transition from the Roman Empire's height to its fragmentation coincided with celestial events that ancient writers interpreted as ominous. In China, dynastic collapses often align with periods of increased eclipse activity noted in imperial records. This does not mean eclipses cause collapse. It suggests they coincide with underlying systemic stress. Ancient scholars understood this distinction. They did not believe the sky destroyed civilizations. They believed it reflected deeper cycles, environmental, social, and psychological. When systems become brittle, even minor disruptions can trigger collapse. Eclipses marked moments when multiple pressures converged. The Red Eclipse, in particular, seems to appear near the peak of such convergence. A red sun is not merely an astronomical curiosity. It often indicates atmospheric disturbance, dust, smoke, volcanic ash. These conditions themselves can affect climate, agriculture, and health. A darkened, reddened sun can be both symbol and symptom of environmental instability. Ancient observers may not have understood the physics, but they noticed the consequences. Failed harvests, unusual weather, disease. These stresses, layered atop political corruption and inequality, create fertile ground for collapse. The red eclipse becomes a marker, not of doom descending from the heavens, but of multiple stressors aligning. This perspective reframes prophecy entirely. Rather than supernatural prediction, it becomes systemic awareness. Ancient cultures recognized that certain celestial cycles coincided with earthly vulnerability. Over time, this recognition hardened into warning. The Templars, inheriting fragments of this understanding, would have seen history not as random tragedy, but as rhythm. Rise, consolidation, stagnation, collapse, renewal. Within this rhythm, the red eclipse marked transition. Not every eclipse mattered, only those occurring at specific points in the cycle, when systems were already strained. This explains why ancient texts differentiate between ordinary and great eclipses. Most pass without consequence. A few coincide with turning points. Modern historians often resist this interpretation because it challenges linear progress. It suggests limits. It implies that collapse is not always avoidable, only manageable. Yet modern data echoes ancient intuition. Economic historians note long cycles of boom and bust. Climate scientists identify periodic shifts affecting agriculture. Sociologists observe repeating patterns of inequality leading to unrest. These cycles operate independently, but occasionally align. When they do, societies become fragile. The red eclipse may simply mark these alignments. From this perspective, ancient prophecy was not mystical exaggeration. It was an attempt to communicate risk across generations. The danger was not the eclipse itself. The danger was ignoring what it coincided with. This insight also explains why such knowledge threatened authority. If collapse follows patterns, then rulers are not uniquely chosen. Institutions are not eternal. Power becomes temporary stewardship rather than divine mandate. Such ideas undermine obedience. The church and monarchy both depended on narratives of permanence. A cyclical worldview threatened that foundation. It suggested that decline was natural, not sinful, and that renewal would come regardless of authority. Suppressing this understanding preserved control. Yet suppression did not stop the cycle. It only ensured that collapse would arrive unprepared. The pattern continues into modern times. Major global crises cluster rather than spread evenly. Financial collapses coincide with political upheaval. Pandemics follow periods of environmental disruption. Trust in institutions erodes rapidly once thresholds are crossed. We still explain these events individually, but together they resemble the same rhythm ancient observers described. The Red Eclipse, then, is not a supernatural harbinger. It is a reminder that human systems exist within larger cycles, that stability is conditional, that collapse is not moral failure alone, but systemic consequence. The Knights Templar, by preserving this perspective, became dangerous not because they predicted disaster, but because they understood timing. They knew that warning too early would be dismissed. Warning too late would be useless. Encoding the pattern was the only option. The collapse pattern is not fate. It is tendency. Awareness does not guarantee prevention, but it allows preparation. It allows adaptation. It allows renewal to emerge with less destruction. Ancient prophecy did not demand fear. It demanded humility. The Red Eclipse stands as a symbol of that humility, a moment when humanity is reminded that it does not stand outside time, but within it. And history shows, again and again, that those who forget this lesson are surprised when the cycle turns. Those who remember survive differently, not untouched, but informed. In a modern world, eclipses no longer inspire panic. We know when they will happen years in advance. We gather with protective glasses, set up cameras, and watch the sky with curiosity rather than fear. Astronomers explain the mechanics with confidence. Orbital planes, predictable cycles, precise mathematics. An eclipse, we are told, is nothing more than the moon passing between Earth and the sun. And yet, something remains unsettled. Despite our knowledge, eclipses still feel different. Crowds fall quiet. The air seems to change. Animals behave strangely. Time feels suspended. Even those who trust science often describe a subtle unease, a sense that something more than shadow is taking place. This emotional response is not superstition. It is memory. Modern astronomy explains how eclipses occur with extraordinary precision, but it deliberately avoids interpreting meaning. Science measures motion, not consequence. It isolates celestial events from human history, treating the sky as indifferent to life below. Ancient observers did the opposite. They could not explain the mechanics, but they tracked the consequences. They noticed what followed eclipses. They remembered which ones coincided with disaster and which passed quietly. Their interpretations were shaped by experience rather than abstraction. This difference in approach has created a deep divide between ancient warning and modern dismissal. To science, an eclipse is neutral. To history, it is contextual. This distinction matters. Modern astronomy operates under the assumption that human systems are independent of celestial cycles. Climate, economy, politics, these are studied separately. When correlations appear, they are often dismissed as coincidence unless causation can be proven. Ancient cultures did not require causation. They required recurrence. If certain events clustered repeatedly, that was enough to warrant attention. They understood that complex systems rarely have single causes. Instead, collapse emerges from convergence, multiple pressures aligning at once. Eclipses marked those moments of alignment. Even today, scientists acknowledge that solar activity influences Earth more than once believed. Solar cycles affect climate patterns, atmospheric chemistry, and even technological infrastructure. Volcanic eruptions, often coinciding with atmospheric changes, can intensify eclipse redness and simultaneously disrupt agriculture. These connections are studied individually. Rarely are they viewed holistically. Ancient warning systems were holistic by necessity. They did not separate sky from earth or nature from society. Everything existed within a single system. When the sky changed, it was not isolated, it was integrated into a broader understanding of vulnerability. Modern society, by contrast, fragments knowledge. Astronomy belongs to physicists. History belongs to historians. Climate belongs to environmental science. Economics belongs to markets. Each discipline speaks its own language, rarely intersecting. The result is precision without synthesis. We know exactly when the next eclipse will occur. We do not ask whether it coincides with rising instability. Ancient warning traditions were not predicting doom. They were highlighting thresholds, moments when stress accumulated to the point where small disturbances could trigger cascading failure. An eclipse did not cause the collapse. It marked the moment when systems were least resilient. This perspective challenges modern confidence. If eclipses are merely shadows, then ancient fear was misplaced. But if eclipses coincided with moments of systemic fragility, then ancient attention was rational, even if the explanation was incomplete. The red eclipse occupies a special place in this tension. Modern astronomy explains red coloration as atmospheric scattering. Dust, pollution, volcanic ash, or smoke filter sunlight, allowing red wavelengths to dominate. This explanation is accurate, but it raises an uncomfortable implication. A red eclipse indicates atmospheric disturbance. Atmospheric disturbance affects climate. Climate affects food supply. Food instability affects society. The ancient warning, stripped of symbolism, becomes logical. A red sun is not a curse. It is a symptom. Ancient observers lacked the language to describe aerosols and scattering, but they understood consequence. When the sun appeared wounded, the world often suffered soon after. Modern science recognizes the mechanisms, but resists the narrative, because narratives influence behavior. To acknowledge that celestial events coincide with vulnerability would invite precaution. It would challenge the belief that progress insulates us from collapse. It would force institutions to confront limits. Instead, eclipses are framed as spectacles. Beautiful, harmless, unrelated to the turbulence below. This framing is comforting. But comfort has always been the enemy of preparedness. The Knights Templar stood between these two worlds. They had access to ancient warnings and emerging calculation. They lived in a time when the sky was still feared, but knowledge was growing. They did not reject astronomy. They embraced it, but they also did not dismiss the accumulated memory of catastrophe. They understood that meaning does not disappear when explanation arrives. Knowing how something works does not erase its significance. A modern analogy would be earthquakes. We understand tectonic plates. We can predict risk zones. We still respect fault lines. We do not build blindly atop them without precaution. Ancient cultures treated eclipses like fault lines in time, moments of increased risk. Modern astronomy explains the movement but ignores the fault. This does not mean ancient prophecy was infallible. Many eclipses passed without consequence. Many disasters occurred without eclipses. But ancient observers were not compiling statistics. They were building cultural memory. Memory prioritizes impact over frequency. The red eclipse was remembered because it coincided with suffering. Modern science prioritizes frequency over meaning. Both approaches reveal something. Together, they reveal more. The danger lies in dismissing one entirely. When ancient warning is ridiculed as superstition, valuable insight is lost. When modern explanation is ignored, fear replaces understanding. The balance lies between acknowledging that celestial cycles exist, acknowledging that human systems are fragile, acknowledging that convergence matters. Modern society prides itself on resilience, yet reacts with shock when crises cluster. Financial collapses, pandemics, climate disasters, political instability, these do not arrive evenly spaced. They arrived together. Ancient observers would not have been surprised. They would have looked to the sky, not as a cause, but as a sign that conditions had aligned. The red eclipse, in this context, becomes less mystical and more unsettling. It suggests that humanity has always sensed vulnerability, even when it lacked explanation. That we encoded warnings into myth because myth endures where data is forgotten. Modern astronomy has not disproven ancient warning. It has simply refused to engage with it, because engaging would require humility, the acceptance that knowledge does not equal control. We can predict eclipses. We cannot predict how societies respond to stress. The Knights Templar preserved ancient warning not because they rejected science, but because they respected memory. They understood that cycles do not care whether they are believed. The sky will darken when it darkens. What follows depends on preparedness. Modern astronomy tells us when the shadow will pass. Ancient warning asks us what state the world will be in when it does. Between these two perspectives lies the truth, not of doom, but of responsibility. The question is not whether eclipses matter. The question is whether we remember why they once did, and whether forgetting that lesson has made us more vulnerable, not less. Every long cycle carries a point of convergence, a moment when scattered patterns align, when fragments of history, prophecy, and calculation suddenly point toward the same horizon. For the Knights Templar and the ancient traditions they inherited, this convergence was never described loudly or clearly. It was hidden, not because it was imaginary, but because it was too precise. The most dangerous knowledge is not vague fear. It is a date. Ancient warning systems avoided naming exact moments openly. Instead, they embedded timing into symbols, ratios, and alignments. A future event was never written plainly. It was placed where only those who understood the system could find it, hidden in plain sight. This is where the idea of a final red eclipse emerges. Not final in the sense of the end of the world, but final in the sense of a cycle completing. The closing of an age. The threshold beyond which history does not continue as it was. Fragments of this idea appear across traditions. In apocryphal texts, references are made to a last sign in the heavens before an age turns. In medieval marginal notes, eclipses are sometimes marked with unusual symbols rather than dates. In architecture attributed to the Templars, certain alignments appear to point not backward, but forward toward a future sky. These are not predictions carved with confidence. They are warnings etched with caution. If the Templars truly reconstructed ancient eclipse cycles, they would have noticed something unsettling. The patterns did not end with their own era. The cycles extended far beyond their lifetimes, beyond their civilization, into a future they would never see. And somewhere along that extension, another convergence appeared. A red eclipse matching the same criteria described in ancient warnings, occurring at a point in a larger cycle associated with instability, transition, and systemic stress. This eclipse was not unique because of its rarity alone. It was unique because of what surrounded it. Ancient calculations did not isolate eclipses. They examined context, social decay, environmental disruption, moral exhaustion. The red eclipse mattered most when these conditions were already present. The final convergence, then, was not a single astronomical event. It was a moment when many lines crossed. This explains why the date, if it existed, was never spoken aloud. A specific date invites obsession. It provokes panic. It tempts manipulation. Ancient custodians understood that knowing when without understanding why is dangerous. So they hid it. They encoded it in stone alignments that only function under certain skies, in numerical ratios that correspond to long cycles, in calendars that appear ceremonial but track deeper rhythms. To the untrained eye, these markers are meaningless. To those who know what to look for, they point quietly forward. Modern researchers who study Templar architecture have noticed something curious. Some sites align not only with solstices and equinoxes, but with solar positions that occur at irregular intervals. These alignments do not repeat annually. They require specific conditions. When tested against astronomical models, Some of these alignments correspond to future eclipses rather than past ones. This is where speculation begins, but not without grounding. If the Templars believed knowledge must survive collapse, then encoding future markers would make sense. They were not writing history. They were preparing for rediscovery. The final red eclipse was not meant for medieval Europe. It was meant for whoever came after. And here, the idea becomes deeply unsettling. Because when fragments of ancient cycles are overlaid with modern astronomical data, certain eclipses stand out. Not because they are mysterious, but because they occur during periods of extraordinary global stress. Rising inequality, environmental instability, political fragmentation, loss of institutional trust. These conditions mirror those described in ancient collapse patterns. Again, this does not mean the eclipse causes the crisis. It means the system is already strained. The eclipse becomes a mirror, reflecting fragility rather than creating it. Ancient custodians would have recognized this moment not as destiny, but as danger. A point where choices matter more because margins are thin. This is why the final red eclipse was not framed as unavoidable destruction. It was framed as a test. In some traditions, the language shifts subtly at this point. Instead of warning of punishment, texts speak of discernment, of division, of paths diverging. The age does not end for everyone in the same way. Those who adapt endure differently. Those who cling to permanence fracture. This is the most misunderstood aspect of ancient prophecy. It was never about predicting an ending. It was about preparing for change. The date, hidden in plain sight, was not a countdown. It was a checkpoint, a moment when accumulated decisions would reveal their consequences. The Knights Templar, if they understood this, would have faced an impossible dilemma. To warn openly would invite suppression. To remain silent would risk unprepared collapse. Their solution was encoding. Not one date, but a framework for recognizing convergence. If future generations notice the same patterns, environmental strain, social unrest, institutional decay, and then looked to the sky and saw the red eclipse, the warning would activate. Not as prophecy, as recognition. Modern society, armed with technology and data, finds itself strangely vulnerable to this idea. We believe prediction equals control. But control depends on response, not foresight. The final red eclipse, then, is not a threat. It is a question. What kind of civilization exists when the shadow passes? Is it resilient or brittle? Flexible or rigid? Aware of cycles or trapped in denial? Ancient warnings suggest that collapse is not uniform. Some structures fall, others transform. Renewal follows destruction, but only where preparation exists. This reframes the entire narrative. The Templars were not guarding doom. They were guarding memory. They believed that when history reached another turning point, humanity would need more than fear or faith. It would need perspective. The date was hidden not to conceal danger, but to prevent misuse. Those obsessed with exact timing often miss the larger pattern. Those who understand the pattern do not need the exact date. The final red eclipse exists less as a moment on a calendar and more as a convergence in awareness. When enough signals align, the warning becomes clear without being spoken. The sky darkens. The sun turns red. And the question is not whether the prophecy was true. The question is whether this time we recognize it not as an ending, but as an opportunity to choose how the next age begins. Hidden in plain sight, the date was never meant to be found. It was meant to be understood, only when the world was ready to look up and inward at the same time. Throughout history, many ideas have been labeled dangerous, but few are as quietly threatening as the belief that collapse follows a pattern. Not a punishment, not a sudden accident, a pattern. Because once people begin to see history as cyclical, authority loses its illusion of permanence. Power becomes temporary, control becomes fragile, and obedience becomes conditional. This is why the Red Eclipse Prophecy, if it existed in coherent form, could not be allowed to survive openly. The suppression of such knowledge was not driven by malice alone. It was driven by fear, rational fear, of what happens when societies believe their future is already written. If people accept that collapse is inevitable, they may stop cooperating with institutions meant to preserve order. Panic spreads. Trust dissolves. The prophecy becomes self-fulfilling. Those in power understood this. Kings rule by belief as much as force. The church governed not only souls, but meaning. Both relied on the idea that the future was responsive, that repentance, loyalty, and obedience could avert disaster. A prophecy grounded in cycles undermined that promise. It suggested that no amount of reform could stop the turning of time. This is why suppression was framed as protection. Protecting society from despair. Protecting faith from fatalism. Protecting order from awareness. Ancient custodians understood this tension well. That is why early eclipse warnings were restricted to priestly elites. The masses were told stories of gods and monsters. The initiated were given patterns and calendars. Knowledge was filtered to prevent misuse. The Knights Templar inherited this burden. They were not anarchists seeking to dismantle authority. They were part of it. They served kings and the church. But they also served time, the long memory of civilizations. Their dilemma was unsolvable. To share what they knew openly would destabilize society. To suppress it completely would doom future generations to repeat the same mistakes blindly. Encoding was the compromise. Authorities who later confronted this encoded knowledge may not have understood it fully, but they sensed its threat. Suppression does not require comprehension. It requires instinct. The instinct that something undermines the narrative of control. This instinct explains the church's selective tolerance of astronomy. Calculating eclipses was acceptable when framed as calendar management or navigation. Interpreting eclipses as markers of historical transition was not. One supports order, the other challenges it. The Red Eclipse Prophecy sat at this boundary. It did not deny God. It denied permanence. It suggested that divine order operated on cycles rather than linear judgment. Such an idea threatened theology itself. Christian doctrine emphasized a beginning and an end, creation and apocalypse. Cyclical time blurred that clarity. It introduced repetition, renewal, continuity beyond collapse. These concepts were not heretical, but they weakened urgency and obedience. If collapse leads to renewal regardless, why fear judgment? Why submit? This is why prophecy had to be moralized. Eclipses became punishments for sin rather than markers of transition. Disaster became a consequence of behavior rather than timing. Responsibility was personalized rather than systemic. This reframing preserved authority. If society collapses because people are sinful, leaders can claim moral superiority. If society collapses because cycles turn, leaders are merely passengers. No institution willingly accepts passenger status. The suppression also served practical power. Kings and elites benefit from belief in progress and stability. Investments, loyalties, and long-term plans depend on confidence and continuity. A prophecy suggesting inevitable decline would disrupt economies and governance. Imagine a medieval kingdom openly acknowledging that collapse was approaching. Land values would plummet. Alliances would fracture. Armies would desert. The prophecy would become a weapon. Suppressing it was rational. The Templars, with their international network and independence, were uniquely positioned to spread such ideas, even unintentionally. Their silence was already unsettling. Their encoded knowledge, if discovered, was unacceptable. Thus, suppression took multiple forms. Public condemnation of the order, destruction of archives, reframing of symbols as heretical, association of their secrecy with evil. All served the same goal: delegitimize the knowledge by destroying its messengers. Yet suppression rarely erases truth completely. It distorts it. The Red Eclipse Prophecy did not disappear. It transformed. It survived as fear without context, as superstition without explanation, as myth without pattern. Friday the 13th became unlucky without memory of why. Eclipses became frightening without understanding of vulnerability. Collapse became moral failure rather than systemic consequence. This distortion was effective. A society afraid but uninformed is easier to govern than a society aware and prepared. But distortion carries a cost. When collapse arrives without warning, it feels sudden and catastrophic. Without understanding cycles, societies blame scapegoats. Violence increases. Trust evaporates. Ancient custodians sought to avoid this outcome. Their warnings were not meant to inspire revolt. They were meant to inspire humility. Acknowledging cycles does not mean surrendering to them. It means adapting to them, preparing for contraction as well as expansion, building resilience rather than illusion. Suppression replaced adaptation with denial. The church and monarchy may have preserved short-term order, but they sacrificed long-term resilience. The medieval collapse that followed the Templars' fall was more devastating because society was unprepared. This pattern repeats. Modern societies also suppress uncomfortable knowledge. Warnings about systemic risk are often minimized until crisis hits. Collapse is framed as shock rather than culmination. The Red Eclipse Prophecy, stripped of myth, is a warning about this behavior. It suggests that awareness matters more than prediction. The prophecy was suppressed not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. It challenged the story that authority tells itself, that it controls time. In reality, authority exists within time. The Templars understood this. Their silence was not cowardice. It was responsibility. They encoded rather than announced because they recognized the psychological danger of raw prophecy. Those who suppressed them did so for similar reasons, but with different intent. One sought continuity. The other sought control. The tragedy is that both feared the same thing, panic. And in avoiding panic, both contributed to unprepared collapse. The lesson buried beneath suppression is not that prophecy should be shouted. It is that cycles should be respected. The Red Eclipse was never a threat to humanity. It was a threat to certainty. And certainty, when mistaken for permanence, has always been the most fragile illusion of all. Section 14. Why the prophecy was suppressed throughout history. Many ideas have been labeled dangerous, but few are as quietly threatening as the belief that collapse follows a pattern. Not a punishment, not a sudden accident, a pattern. Because once people begin to see history as cyclical, authority loses its illusion of permanence. Power becomes temporary, control becomes fragile, and obedience becomes conditional. This is why the Red Eclipse Prophecy, if it existed in coherent form, could not be allowed to survive openly. The suppression of such knowledge was not driven by malice alone. It was driven by fear, rational fear, of what happens when societies believe their future is already written. If people accept that collapse is inevitable, they may stop cooperating with institutions meant to preserve order. Panic spreads. Trust dissolves. The prophecy becomes self-fulfilling. Those in power understood this. Kings rule by belief as much as force. The church governed not only souls, but meaning. Both relied on the idea that the future was responsive, that repentance, loyalty, and obedience could avert disaster. A prophecy grounded in cycles undermined that promise. It suggested that no amount of reform could stop the turning of time. This is why suppression was framed as protection. Protecting society from despair. Protecting faith from fatalism. Protecting order from awareness. Ancient custodians understood this tension well. That is why early eclipse warnings were restricted to priestly elites. The masses were told stories of gods and monsters. The initiated were given patterns and calendars. Knowledge was filtered to prevent misuse. The Knights Templar inherited this burden. They were not anarchists seeking to dismantle authority. They were part of it. They served kings and the church. But they also served time, the long memory of civilizations. Their dilemma was unsolvable. To share what they knew openly would destabilize society. To suppress it completely would doom future generations to repeat the same mistakes blindly. Encoding was the compromise. Authorities who later confronted this encoded knowledge may not have understood it fully, but they sensed its threat. Suppression does not require comprehension. It requires instinct. the instinct that something undermines the narrative of control. This instinct explains the Church's selective tolerance of astronomy. Calculating eclipses was acceptable when framed as calendar management or navigation. Interpreting eclipses as markers of historical transition was not. One supports order, the other challenges it. The Red Eclipse Prophecy sat at this boundary. It did not deny God. It denied permanence. It suggested that divine order operated on cycles rather than linear judgment. Such an idea threatened theology itself. Christian doctrine emphasized a beginning and an end, creation and apocalypse. Cyclical time blurred that clarity. It introduced repetition, renewal, continuity beyond collapse. These concepts were not heretical, but they weakened urgency and obedience. If collapse leads to renewal regardless, why fear judgment? Why submit? This is why prophecy had to be moralized. Eclipses became punishments for sin rather than markers of transition. Disaster became a consequence of behavior rather than timing. Responsibility was personalized rather than systemic. This reframing preserved authority. If society collapses because people are sinful, leaders can claim moral superiority. If society collapses because cycles turn, leaders are merely passengers. No institution willingly accepts passenger status. The suppression also served practical power. Kings and elites benefit from belief in progress and stability. Investments, loyalties, and long-term plans depend on confidence and continuity. A prophecy suggesting inevitable decline would disrupt economies and governance. Imagine a medieval kingdom openly acknowledging that collapse was approaching. Land values would plummet. Alliances would fracture. Armies would desert. The prophecy would become a weapon. Suppressing it was rational. The Templars, with their international network and independence, were uniquely positioned to spread such ideas, even unintentionally. Their silence was already unsettling. Their encoded knowledge, if discovered, was unacceptable. Thus, suppression took multiple forms. Public condemnation of the order, destruction of archives, reframing of symbols as heretical, association of their secrecy with evil, all served the same goal: delegitimize the knowledge by destroying its messengers. Yet suppression rarely erases truth completely. It distorts it. The Red Eclipse Prophecy did not disappear. It transformed. It survived as fear without context, as superstition without explanation, as myth without pattern. Friday the 13th became unlucky without memory of why. Eclipses became frightening without understanding of vulnerability. Collapse became moral failure rather than systemic consequence. This distortion was effective. A society afraid but uninformed is easier to govern than a society aware and prepared. But distortion carries a cost. When collapse arrives without warning, it feels sudden and catastrophic. Without understanding cycles, societies blame scapegoats. Violence increases. Trust evaporates. Ancient custodians sought to avoid this outcome. Their warnings were not meant to inspire revolt. They were meant to inspire humility. Acknowledging cycles does not mean surrendering to them. It means adapting to them, preparing for contraction as well as expansion, building resilience rather than illusion. Suppression replaced adaptation with denial. The church and monarchy may have preserved short-term order, but they sacrificed long-term resilience. The medieval collapse that followed the Templars' fall was more devastating because society was unprepared. This pattern repeats. Modern societies also suppress uncomfortable knowledge. Warnings about systemic risk are often minimized until crisis hits. Collapse is framed as shock rather than culmination. The Red Eclipse Prophecy, stripped of myth, is a warning about this behavior. It suggests that awareness matters more than prediction. The prophecy was suppressed not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. It challenged the story that authority tells itself, that it controls time. In reality, authority exists within time. The Templars understood this. Their silence was not cowardice. It was responsibility. They encoded rather than announced because they recognized the psychological danger of raw prophecy. Those who suppressed them did so for similar reasons, but with different intent. One sought continuity, the other sought control. The tragedy is that both feared the same thing, panic. And in avoiding panic, both contributed to unprepared collapse. The lesson buried beneath suppression is not that prophecy should be shouted. It is that cycles should be respected. The Red Eclipse was never a threat to humanity. It was a threat to certainty. And certainty, when mistaken for permanence, has always been the most fragile illusion of all.